Information overload these days, doesn't it? So many headlines, opinions everywhere. It's hard to know what's actually important.
Absolutely. And that's really the idea behind the deep dive, isn't it? To help cut through some of that.
Exactly. We take a source, the kind of thing you might see floating around and want to understand better, and we try to really get to the core of it. Less noise, more clarity.
We basically act as your guides. We dig into the main arguments, try to see the big picture, and hopefully make it all a bit clearer for you.
So for this deep dive, we're tackling excerpts from a YouTube video transcript. It features the journalist Chris Hedges, and, fair warning, it's a pretty intense piece of analysis.
It definitely is. Our mission here is to unpack the key ideas he's presenting, make them accessible, without you getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Right. Not a play-by-play, but hitting the highlights, the core arguments Hedges puts forward in this specific transcript. Okay, so interestingly, the video transcript actually starts with someone else, a speaker from the Stolen Nation. It's brief, but it sets a certain tone.
It really does. They offer this greeting, talking about meeting newcomers with a good heart and mind. And there's this interesting point about Canada being, relatively speaking, a young country. It adds a different perspective right away.
And that line about needing to fight for the children, that really sticks with you. It brings in this idea of future responsibility.
Then the focus shifts to Chris Hedges. For listeners who maybe aren't super familiar with him, what's the important context?
Well, Hedges is an award-winning journalist. He often focuses on voices that don't always get heard, marginalized perspectives. He's known for challenging power structures.
And it's crucial to remember, while his analysis is informed by his reporting and experiences, the interpretation he offers here is very much his own intellectual take on things.
Got it. So he dives into some pretty big concepts, starting with Karl Marx. Now, Marx, that can be intimidating. What's the key idea Hedges pulling from him here?
Okay, so the main thing Hedges focuses on is Marx's prediction about the, let's call it the later stages of capitalism. The argument is basically that as capitalism matures globally, it gets harder and harder to make profits like it used to.
Right.
So to keep those profits up, things that actually benefit society, think democracy, social programs, public investment, they start getting cut back, sacrificed for short-term gain.
And the worry is that this eventually backfires.
That's the prediction, yeah. That this relentless drive for profit ends up damaging the very society it relies on. It sort of destroys the host, is the phrase often used.
Okay, and this is where Hedges makes a contemporary link. He argues that Donald Trump represents this specific stage of capitalism. How does he make that connection?
Hedges sees Trump's actions and the political movement around him as symptoms of this late capitalism. He mentions, for instance, the significant Republican control of state governments at the time as evidence of a political environment prioritizing these narrow economic goals above other things.
And he describes it in pretty strong terms, doesn't he? It's not just politics as usual, in his view.
Not at all. He uses phrases like a final campaign of corporate pillaging and the rise of a kleptocracy.
Kleptocracy ruled by thieves, essentially.
Basically, yes. But Hedges argues it's bigger than just like individuals lining their own pockets. It's about a systematic diversion of public money, federal funds towards cronies, towards unethical companies, financial elites. He uses this stark business term. Everything is being harvested.
Wow, harvested. Okay. He also talks about dismantling the liberal state. What does that mean in this context?
When he says liberal state, he's generally referring to the institutions and policies designed to provide social safety nets, protect rights, uphold democratic norms. His argument is that these are being deliberately weakened, torn down even.
And at the same time, something else is being built up.
Exactly. Militarization. He points to the huge increases in the defense budget, despite already massive spending.
But it's not just the regular military he's concerned about.
No, he specifically highlights the expansion of groups like ICE and Border Patrol, more agents, more cooperation with local police. And he asks this really chilling question. Once these forces have dealt with the undocumented population, who do they target next?
That's a disturbing thought. Does he suggest who?
He does. He mentions Muslims, African Americans, Asian communities, even political dissidents. The core of his argument is that this militarization is being built, in the eyes of Trump and his allies, to fight what they see as an inevitable race war, both here and abroad.
And he's not saying this might happen, he thinks it's already started.
Yes, he points to things happening right now or at the time of the recording in poor communities of color. Increased racial profiling, more stops and searches, immigration raids, deportations, the DACA situation, families being separated. He sees these as the opening shots.
He then makes a really provocative comparison linking Trump's executive orders to infamous historical laws.
He does. He argues these orders aren't about making America great in some general sense, but specifically about making it white. He draws parallels to things like the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany, Jim Crow in the U.S. South, the Chinese Exclusion Act, suggesting a pattern aimed at creating a racial hierarchy.
And this hierarchy has real-world consequences for rights.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He describes these communities as increasingly resembling police states, where basic rights like due process are eroded, where police operate with less accountability, and rights become privileges that can be revoked.
Is it only people of color he sees being targeted?
No, he extends the concern. He mentions threats against Jewish community centers, vandalism of cemeteries, as signs that the persecution is widening.
To give this some theoretical backing, he brings in the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. What's the key idea there?
Bauman's insight is about the connection between social rights like welfare, basic services, and political rights, like voting, participating in democracy. Bauman said if people lack basic social security, their political rights don't mean much, and vice versa. Social rights need political rights to be protected. They're intertwined, you know.
Right, they depend on each other. Okay, now, a really central figure in Hedges' analysis seems to be Stephen Bannon. What's the picture Hedges paints of Bannon's ideology?
Hedges portrays Bannon as believing in a kind of historical destiny, almost. He sees Western culture as weakened, contaminated, blaming influences from non-white people and non-Western faiths. His view is described as conspiratorial, this idea of a necessary global war between the white race and so-called lesser breeds to purify America.
This theme of violence leading to renewal seems important.
Very much so. Hedges notes it has roots in some American thinking, but it's also a core tenet of fascist ideology. He puts figures like Michael Anton and Stephen Miller in this same intellectual camp influencing Trump.
And Bannon apparently follows a specific historical theory, the fourth turning.
Yeah, the Strauss and Howe theory. It posits these roughly 80-year cycles, each ending in a huge crisis, a turning, often involving war, that reshapes everything. Bannon supposedly sees things like the American Revolution or World War II as these turnings. Hedges is extremely critical of this, comparing these kinds of thinkers to those who gave intellectual cover to the Nazis.
Now, Hedges himself is critical of corporate globalization, but he strongly rejects Bannon's solutions, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
He might share the distaste for some effects of globalization, but he calls Bannon's idea of a total war by the white race completely insane. He also dismisses Bannon's diagnosis of the problems, blaming things like New Deal, 60s, white guilt, liberals, jihadist Islamic fascism. Hedges points out that Bannon's view totally ignores racism, misogyny, the crimes of empire.
What about the possibility of Trump being removed? Does Hedges discuss that?
He does. He suggests the deep state, intelligence agencies, corporations, the financial sector might eventually move against Trump because he's too unstable. But he warns that a replacement, maybe someone like Mike Pence, could actually be more effective at pushing the far-right agenda, especially the Christian rights goals.
He gives specific examples of people in power he sees as destructive.
Yeah, he mentions Betsy DeVos and her impact on public education, pushing charter schools, and Scott Pruitt at the EPA rolling back environmental rules, cutting the budget, denying climate change science. Agents of destruction, he calls them.
And Bannon's direct influence on policy, particularly anti-Muslim policy.
Hedges stresses Bannon's role in the travel ban affecting Muslim-majority countries and the push to create lists of radicalized Muslim groups and individuals in the U.S. He sees this as incredibly dangerous, potentially criminalizing leaders and institutions and setting a precedent for targeting other groups, later journalists, activists, whoever.
There's that quote from Bannon about wanting to bring everything crashing down. How does Hedges frame that?
He sees it not just as an individual impulse, but as part of a much longer project by corporate power to undermine democracy. It's the combination, in his view, of decades of effort.
Which leads to this idea of a corporate coup d'etat. What does he mean by that?
He argues that for the last 40 years or so, there's been this slow-motion corporate takeover, maybe starting with the Powell memo back in '71, It's led to weaker democratic institutions, the decline of unions, a less independent press, universities becoming less critical, and money just dominating politics.
And he even suggests that mainstream liberals played a part in this.
Yeah, his argument is that figures like the Clintons or Obama talked the talk of liberal democracy, but enacted policies that helped corporations. This, he argues, discredited liberal democracy in many people's eyes, opening the door for something more extreme.
There's a particularly blunt statement attributed to Stephen Miller about the courts.
Right. Miller reportedly said the judiciary had too much power and that the president's power to protect the nation shouldn't really be questioned by courts. Very direct.
Given all this, Hedges really emphasizes learning from history. Why is that so crucial for him?
Because history, looking at collapses like ancient Greece, Rome, Weimar Germany, Yugoslavia, shows us the warning signs. It helps us recognize the patterns on the road to tyranny. He mentions thinkers like Thucydides, Fritz Stern, who wrote about the dangers of unchecked power and how fascism appeals when mainstream politics fails.
And who are the real enemies, according to Hedges? Not necessarily the ones we always hear about.
Exactly. He contrasts the manufactured enemies of the war machine with what he sees as the actual threats. The elites pushing neoliberal economics and empire.
He also talks about a fundamental shift in how wealth is made now.
Yes, a shift away from making things, from production towards finance, towards speculation, what he calls casino capitalism. Wealth comes from manipulating markets, creating debt, preying on desperation. He names figures like Sheldon Adelson, Paul Singer, Robert Mercer as examples of people who, in his view, mainly move wealth upwards, not create it.
And he doesn't mince words describing these figures.
No, he calls them traitors, parasites. He even brings up 17th century England, where financial speculation was a serious crime, suggesting today's financial elites deserve similar condemnation.
He uses a literary analogy, Faulkner's Snopes family, for Trump and his circle. What's the comparison?
The Snopes family represents this sort of morally bankrupt, opportunistic group that rises to power as society decays. Hedges uses it to suggest Trump and his allies lack a real moral compass. They just mimic the outward forms of society without understanding the substance. They're the scum rising to the top in this analogy.
What does he see as their core values then?
Conflict, violence, misogyny, rage. These are seen as signs of strength. Militarism and war are the ultimate ideal. Their whole worldview needs enemies to function.
And he identifies one group as the vanguard of this movement.
Christian fascists. He sees them as the leading edge, driven by messianic delusions, using Bible quotes to justify bigotry, while being, in his words, intellectually incurious and historically illiterate.
What is it that white supremacists and Christian fascists fundamentally fail to grasp, according to Hedges?
He argues their narrowness prevents them from seeing the humanity in others. They mistake their own prejudice for honesty, their ignorance for innocence. They can't distinguish reality from their own fantasies.
Which connects to how evil is defined and how scapegoating works.
Yes. Evil becomes embodied in this dehumanized other. It creates this endless cycle. Identify a group, target them for annihilation, then find the next group. He traces it from historical anti-Semitism to targeting Muslims and the undocumented today.
He quotes the writer Danilo Kiss on nationalism.
Right, Kiss basically calls the nationalists an ignoramus. Nationalism is easy, Kiss says. It requires no thought, just the assumption that everyone else thinks like you.
And the danger when fanatics get power.
They always become inquisitors. They crush dissent. And because Trump lacks a strong ideology himself, Hedges argues his vacuum is being filled by the Christian right, who do have a rigid agenda.
This leads to some really grim predictions for the future if this trend continues. Can you summarize those?
Yeah, it's bleak. He foresees workers becoming like serfs, dissent being criminalized, accelerated environmental destruction, more scapegoating, the rise of magical thinking over reason, and culture degrading into nationalist propaganda.
And a direct assault on truth itself.
Absolutely. An attack on facts, promoting confusion, blurring truth and lies. He argues this creates massive anxiety and cognitive dissonance. Demagogues, he says, spread their own psychosis through relentless lying.
He's also critical of the Democratic Party's response, or lack thereof.
Yes, he blames them for not fundamentally challenging corporate power, for playing their own political games, which he believes left the door open for despotism. Their failure discredited liberal democracy itself.
He talks about controlling information, silencing dissent within government and media. What's the goal there?
The goal, in his analysis, is to replace reality with a fabricated, internally consistent fantasy world. He quotes Hannah Arendt on totalitarian propaganda, creating this lying world.
And the result of traditional institutions, courts, universities, press failing or being seen as failing?
It leads to a massive loss of public trust, which then makes it easy for someone like Trump to attack those very institutions and gain traction.
He also notes a breakdown in just basic democratic norms, the way politics is conducted.
Yeah, Trump rejecting democratic etiquette. Hedges, again, brings in Unt, who observed that when things decay, people find it easier to believe absurd lies than old truths that no longer seem relevant.
How does Trump's style to theatricality fit in?
Hedges argues it conditions the public to value emotional response, spectacle, over substance and facts. It's about the feeling, not the reality.
Arndt's view on systematic lying, its ultimate aim.
Not just to deceive, according to Arndt, but to actually transform human nature, to create apathy, cynicism, a state where people just give up on truth altogether. Somnambulism, she called it.
And how do demagogues keep the momentum going?
By constantly inventing new enemies. It keeps their base agitated, focused outwards, never looking at the real problems or the leader's failings. Arndt's analogy was the persistent insulter who keeps people off balance.
Okay, so it's a very dark picture. But Hedges does offer ways to respond, right? What does he suggest?
He does. Building strong communities for mutual support. Allowing space for mourning what's being lost.
Yeah.
Clearly naming the problems the psychosis, as he puts it. Engaging in civil disobedience. And crucially, having dialogues grounded in truth and empathy.
What about personal resilience?
Super important. He stresses investing in things that nourish us psychologically. Nature, art, music, spiritual practice to maintain strength.
But he's skeptical about elections being the sole answer.
Yeah, he sees the forces at play as much bigger than Trump, as global reactionary movements. So just voting, while necessary, isn't enough on its own to fix the root problems.
What kind of resistance does he favor?
Nonviolent resistance. He argues strongly against violence, saying it plays into the hands of the security state. He looks to figures like Martin Luther King Jr. for strategy nonviolence wins broader support.
He acknowledges the power people have collectively.
Yes, the power to make any country ungovernable if enough people act together. But he also warns that the time to organize effectively might be limited.
And the ultimate enemy, in his view?
Corporate power. The system itself. He argues for a need for an alternative vision socialist, anti-capitalist to truly counter it.
Does he see any glimmers of hope?
He does. In the protests, the sheer number of people taking action. And also in the potential for civil servants, people inside the system, to refuse to cooperate with unjust orders.
And action needs to happen on multiple levels.
Definitely. Both local, protecting vulnerable neighbors, and national pushing for systemic change.
What's his take on the current state of liberal institutions?
He sees them as largely hollowed out, existing in name only, compromised by corporate money. He believes we need new, radical movements and parallel institutions, free from that influence.
And the importance of real-world connection.
Crucial. Building actual relationships in communities, not just online activism. That's where real, resilient movements are built.
What about alliances, working with people you don't agree with on everything?
He sees it as essential. Building broad coalitions, shedding ideological purity. He references Saul Alinsky practical organizing over rigid dogma.
And addressing basic needs.
Yes, recognizing that people need their basic economic and physical security met before they can effectively participate in resistance. He points to groups like Vancouver Rape Relief as understanding this.
His view on how power responds.
Stark. Power only responds when it feels threatened, he argues. Appealing to his conscience is usually futile. Politics is a game of fear. In this view.
So the ending, it's a call to action, but with a sense of hope.
It is. He acknowledges the darkness, but insists on the possibility of victory through defiance, solidarity. He invokes Kant on justice. He stresses that small acts of resistance matter, that being an example of empathy matters. The final lines are powerful about being remembered for trying, for keeping hope alive, even in dark times.
Okay, so that's the deep dive into this particular Chris Hedges analysis. We've really covered a lot. His views on rising authoritarianism, the role of corporate power, inequality, the assault on truth. It's all interconnected in his framework. Exactly. And hopefully, for you listening, you now have a much clearer handle on these challenging perspectives he puts forward.
Which naturally leads to our final thought for you to take away. After hearing this analysis unpacked, what specific action, even a small one, do you feel is the most crucial first step in pushing back against these trends Hedges describes?
Something important to mull over as you process all this.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it gave you some food for thought. Feel free to share your own reflections if you like.
And definitely join us next time. We'll be digging into a completely different set of sources. Stay tuned to find out what's next on the deep dive.